international trade. So it's a real high honor and a distinction to have you on to start our discussions today, looking at Canada and Africa in this whole post-COVID period and how we can strengthen the bonds. And we have, as Gareth has said, we have over 500 people on the call today, and this tells you the scale of interest both in Africa and in Canada on this. So again, thank you so much, and thank you for making the time. The Honorable Minister, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Sebastian. You've made it a very difficult thing. I don't think, how do you pick one African country over another? It's all so extraordinary. I feel like, we're going to have to find a way to, to be all inclusive in one way or another. And of course, thank you so much, Gareth, as well, and everyone indeed for joining us. And I know that also on the Zoom is my colleagues, members of Parliament, Yasmin Ratanzi and Sven Spengeman, and also Parliamentary Secretary Rob Oliphant is here. I know that you'll be hearing from Rob a little later. It's always a joy to be here with my colleagues as well. We are one big team, and I certainly couldn't do what I do as humbling to serve in this portfolio without their good work. So it's wonderful to be here with them, and also to the ambassadors and the so many members of the diplomatic corps who's joined us. It's an honor to also have you with us today. So thank you so much for taking your very valuable time. And I really do want to thank the African Canada Chamber of Business for bringing all of us together and hosting events like this one and offering COVID-19 related resources to your members and working with our government and helping Canadian businesses think about and work through exporting into markets like those in the African countries. The Chamber has really played a leadership role. You've always played a leadership role, and during these challenging times, it's even more important. So thank you so much for your good work and your determination. We certainly need all of that at this time. And Sebastian and Gareth and others, it really does seem like a very long time ago when we were all together in Africa, and where we were talking about, Canada, Canadian businesses working in collaboration and finding those opportunities both ways for African businesses and for Canadian businesses. But it was only 3 months ago, and boy, have things changed in this short term. And throughout the trade mission, it really was excellent to see Canadian businesses and work across the African continent, building on relationships, learning from each other, and sharing innovative ideas and solutions. And a really good memory for me was, of course, signing the MOU between the Africa Canada Chamber of Business and the Ethiopian Chamber of Commerce and the sectoral associations. It was an important step, I think, to advance our goal between our countries. And I think for those who remember, we did the signing, and then somewhere, right afterwards, when we were sort of all getting together, we managed to co-opt the Prime Minister and have him come in and say hello to everyone to congratulate sort of in an informal way. So that was really sort of, that was lovely, but it really does speak to just the fondness and the opportunities that exist between businesses in both of our countries. And it was also nice to, to follow up the mission, if you will, in Africa, but with many business leaders and individuals, including, Sebastian, you and chamber members in Toronto at PDAC, which only happened in March, so very shortly after the trip to Africa. We were able to do some, we were able to connect again with some of the people and the businesses to whom we had met, and started, flourishing those relationships on Canadian soil. And that took place sort of fairly quickly, sort of one upon the other. And that's good. And while we are not together physically today, you can, the numbers that are here really indicates the spirit of this collaboration and this cooperation. And our government do believe that it's really important to support our people and our businesses during this very challenging time. I think that no one will dispute how hard it has been for people and for businesses during COVID-19, and that what the government of Canada needed to do was to stand up and make sure that our people and our businesses were supported through this difficult time. So we have announced some significant measures to help people and businesses. We've asked Canadians to do something very extraordinary to flatten the curve in this country. They're staying at home. They are looking after their children. They are looking after their elderly, parents. They're looking after themselves by staying at home and helping to stop the spread of COVID-19. And this has had a significant impact on Canadian businesses. Businesses have been impacted because they've either had to close down or significantly scale their operations. So we've had to, we've put economic measures out that will help businesses and people during this time, whether it is a Canadian emergency response benefit where Canadians who are making less than $1,000 a month are seeing a support of $2,000 a month so that they don't have to worry about putting food on the table or having a roof over their head, helping small businesses keep their employees. We know that many businesses, because they were impacted, were facing, that very difficult decision of having to lay off people, or they've already laid off people. So making sure that they had a wage subsidy support from the government of Canada so that businesses and people, their employees, can be kept together so that when it's safe to do so, that road to recovery is strengthened because the businesses are together. And today, the Prime Minister announced that we are going to, we will be extending the wage subsidy, and we'll have more details about that beyond June. And then making sure that our small businesses had the support to pay the bills. If your business isn't running, then it's pretty hard to pay those operating expenses and the bills. So for our smallest of businesses, making available $40,000 interest-free loans, $10,000 of that, or 25%, is forgivable if businesses are able to pay that back by the end of 2022, just to help with cash flow, and just doing a number of other measures, which I won't go into, but many, many measures that are really focused on helping Canadians and helping Canadian businesses weather through COVID-19. And Canada continues to also play a leadership role on the world stage. International cooperation is crucial as we all work towards economic recovery, and those recovery that has to prioritize the health and safety of our people and to minimize the economic impact, and not leaving anybody behind, but at the forefront ensuring that we are taking a measured approach so that the health and safety of Canadians is absolutely our top priority, but also not ever staying too distant away. For me, certainly as the International Trade Minister, making sure that we're working with our international partners to keep trade and supply chains open so that Canadian businesses and enterprises around the globe have the stability that they need, and that people can continue to access essential goods and services during this critical time. Those essential goods and services are medicines, they are medical supplies, products. So I've been working with my G20 trade minister partners to make sure that we continue to be public about the importance of supply chains staying open, and that trade and investment is still, of course, important despite the difficulty of COVID-19. Working with the World Trade Organization during this time, working with organizations like APEC and others, just to make sure that essential trade keeps flowing and to mitigate the economic impacts of COVID-19 for Canadians, but also for people around the world. And as we look towards, as we look ahead, we remain committed to building on our trade diversification in Africa. For example, pursuing negotiations with Ethiopia to develop a foreign investment promotion and protection agreement, which would provide Canadian investors and businesses with a more transparent and predictable trading environment. And, with shared priorities of creating more good jobs, finding sustainable solutions for our economic growth. And Canada has an important trading and investment partner for Africa's many dynamic economies. So even through these challenging times, we want to build on our close partnerships with African countries, strengthening our economic relationships, deepening our people-to-people ties. And I know we're going to get through this together. It's very challenging. It's like that for Canada, but it's like that around the world. And as we gradually take steps to, restarting our respective economies, we're going to have to keep supporting our businesses, our workers, indeed, all the people of Canada. I've been saying this a lot, and it is very true. We are going to get through this, but only by doing so together. So thank you again so much for giving me this time to speak. And I look forward to having a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. And our WhatsApp line, as well as the Q&A, is lit up with some fantastic questions. The first one today from our nation's capital. Minister, you have spent extensive time in Africa. We also know there can be no trade diversification without Africa, citing the Business Council of Canada's recent report and several other studies. The question is, what do you see Canadian businesses of all sizes, what role are they playing in your government's trade diversification strategy, particularly given COVID-19?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, absolutely. I mean, before COVID-19, of course, we were firing on all cylinders, making sure that Canadian businesses were supported and, and assisting them and supporting them in that growth. So the growth in trade, the growth in exporting and growing into, some very exciting markets and developing those relationships to ensure that we have those business relationships, we have those trade relationships. And of course, Africa is important. And that was what, of course, my visit and certainly the Prime Minister's visit, to Africa was about being able to build on our relationships and to increase the footprint of Canadian businesses in sub-Saharan Africa. In that trip was essential, and to enhance the trade services in the region so that we can create sort of those better links. And COVID-19 has certainly created a global challenge. It's affecting the way that businesses operate, not just here in Canada, but all around the world. And the reality is that our efforts to control and mitigate the spread of the virus have further implications for Canadian businesses operating in the global marketplace. In these times that are uncertain, it's more important than ever for us to ensure that Canadian companies are supported so that our economies stay strong and that our people remain healthy and they remain safe. And we're committed to supporting our Canadian exporters, but supporting Canadian businesses. And even if they're not exporting yet, we want them to in the future. So the significant economic packages that we have put out to support Canadians and Canadian businesses is intended to do that. So helping businesses get through this period is absolutely critical. And for example, also the support that we're providing through Export Development Canada, so that they are helping their existing clients to ensure that they weather through this period is important. So we put significant investment to make sure that the EDC is stood up so that they can actually support those businesses looking for that critical, whether it's insurance support or liquidity support during the any particular businesses that operate abroad. But I think this is why it's so critical to have to continue our relationships and our dialogues, even while things have changed significantly, to keep these up so that free, stable trade and investment environment is never strays too far from our minds, particularly as we get into the recovery period, and making sure that that international cooperation, that we continue to work on that. I know I do. I know my colleague, the Foreign Minister, does, and I know that Parliamentary Secretary Oliphant, who is here. We've all been tirelessly working with Canadians, but certainly to ensure that our international relationships are not are continuously reinvigorated and just kept up during this time. And of course, the entire team of trade commissioners that operate, across Africa are there, and they continue to work. And some of them may be, well, many of us are working remotely, but ensuring that work continues.
Thank you, Minister. And that outlines the extensive measures from government. The next question seems to go more toward your view on what those of us at the Chamber, as well as in the diaspora, should be doing. The question goes, like so many of us who have immigrated to Canada, we're connected in a particular way to the continent. What is the role of that diaspora in Canada in making sure that the message of what you're doing here not only reaches communities in Canada, but also back on the African continent, where we seek to maintain the status as partner of choice for Africa?
Yeah, that is such a good question. Gareth, you, Sebastian, and others have certainly heard me say this before. Canadians and Canadian businesses are so well positioned to do business in the world because we all come from around the world. So the links that we have, the diaspora community here in Canada, of course, is integral to Canada's economic competitiveness. And they have been, they are today, and they will be for years to come. And the diaspora of any country has advantages in terms of doing business because they're able to sort of create those connections. If Canada is their home, but their countries of origin is also closely linked, and this is where the Canada Africa Chamber of Business is also a very key partner in these efforts, because it is in this collaboration, it is in this sharing of information, it is this ability to be able to share information back and forth is what is key. And for the diaspora here in Canada, really important that we support them. So I talked about these measures before, but I don't think that I can overstate how important it is for our diaspora businesses to be supported right now in Canada with keeping their employees, with the cash flow support, and all of the other measures that are helping them through this period so they can weather this period, so that we can get beyond this period and into recovery when it's safe to do so.
Excellent. Thank you, Minister. And finally, a question from a board member of one of our partner organizations. What is the message specific to the Chamber and its members as well in Africa in ensuring that Canada as a partner in a time of crisis is particularly well understood? And I think that is informed by the feeling that a lot of countries have turned inward and Canada's not doing that. Any initial response to that final question?
Yeah, I think it's important to keep reinforcing the strong economic relationship and how important it is to Canada's ongoing prosperity, and certainly as we get onto the road of rebuilding our economies post-COVID-19. I certainly have, ensured, along with my colleagues, to reiterate how important international collaboration is, that global supply chains continue to stay open, that trade and investment is something that is important to Canada, and that we are a destination, for both trade and investment. And I think that reinforcing the importance of the economic relationships and how much we actually do depend on trade and want to and utilize trade as a way of being able to provide prosperity for our people, all of our peoples. And I think that this is that this message really is worthy of continuing to to repeat. And it's also being able to work to support those multilateral like the World Trade Organization, who we want to and continue to need to support, to work with, so that into recovery and post-recovery, that even where there may be trade barriers that might have come up as a result of COVID-19, that there's transparency and that there is a commitment to remove them as quickly as possible, so that we can help rebuild and continue those very important economic relationships and trade relationships between our two countries, and indeed globally.
Minister, thank you so much. And to all of those who've asked questions, we've got dozens and dozens. I can assure you, working with the Minister's office and with our chamber, we'll get you those answers, a lot of them related to export assistance. In closing, I'd like to invite another veteran when it comes to the Africa file, Member of Parliament Rob Oliphant, who's well known in the diplomatic community and across the continent. Mr. Oliphant, I'll welcome you in providing the closing remarks for this particular component of the webinar.
Thank you, Gareth. I did disappear for a while during that with a Wi-Fi problem at home, but I was able to listen, and so I was able to hear. And Minister, thank you for representing all of us so well on the international stage, as well as your work with small business. It is really, in my own writing, I am seeing how important that is for your work. And Your Excellencies and members of the Chamber, thank you for your work. I have spoken to a number of the ambassadors and high commissioners who are on the Zoom meeting today, and I have been hearing the issues that you are facing, whether it is real concern about healthcare and healthcare capacity, and through our colleague Minister Gold, we are working out multilaterally through that, and also responding to some bilateral requests on the healthcare issues. Secondly, we recognize that ongoing peace and security are issues that Canada is absolutely committed to in a broad Africa policy. And then trade and investment. It's a three-legged stool for us. We understand that we always need to be part of a humanitarian and development program, that Africa still needs help. And we never deny that. We will be there to help level the playing field. But also we recognize that we're into a new age, and that it's an age where investment and trade are of utmost concern, both to Canadians and to Africans. And the third one is on peace and security and parliamentary democracy. So we're committed to all of these things. And then COVID-19 has revealed two things. It's revealed that all of us are dependent on each other, that if anyone is sick anywhere in the world, all of us will feel that. And we have a vested interest in all 54 countries in Africa having the health capacity to meet this challenge, or we're not going to be able to defeat a virus. It's revealed also fault lines. It's revealed that we need to strengthen those relationships, both bilaterally, through investment in industry and trade opportunities, and through mobility and making sure that we're able to go between our continents more easily. And it's revealed how important that is. Zoom meetings are great, but getting that transit happening, working on logistics for companies that want to bring materials from Africa to Canada, or are doing business in Africa and need to have supply chains and all the logistics that go into that. And the government of Canada is absolutely committed to improving those business relationships, helping sell, I use that word advisedly, sell Africa as an investment opportunity for Canadian businesses, and recognizing that while we're growing the middle class in Canada, we're also wanting to grow the middle class in Africa. And that's for the well-being of Africans in a variety of different places, whether it's an economic engine like South Africa or Nigeria, or Mali, or any other country that is really struggling to find their way up to become a low middle income country. We're there, and we want to continue to do that. And so Minister Champagne was able to get to Africa 3 times in the last while. Minister Ng has been there, Minister Gould has been there, I've been there, the Prime Minister has been there. And I need to tell you, as the past chair of Canada Africa Parliamentary Association, this phase of our government is a dream come true for me. I have been pushing on Africa for the last 5 years. I feel like doors have opened in our government. Minister Ng has been doing that. She has recognized how critically important Africa is for Canadian business development. You know, we're not really here just to help Africa. Canadian businesses are critically important. Mm-hmm. And if our businesses are going to develop, we need Africa to be strong and to be a place of transparency and global activity. And the last McKinsey report that I got to see, was in February. We had the breakfast in the Rideau Club. There was a sense of hopefulness that we're going to do that. COVID-19 has taken our wind out of our sails just for a moment, but it's also reminded us how dependent we are. So I'm excited about that. I will give a shameless pitch, especially to the heads of mission who are on the call today, and for the diaspora community to recognize how important it is that Canada gets a seat on the UN Security Council. That is a way, and I describe that opportunity is not a seat at the table, but we're going to bring a whole couch. We're going to have a big, wide seat, and on that couch, Africa will sit with us. We will always remember the aspirations of Africans, the hopes and dreams of African people, and the opportunities that African businesses and that bilateral exchange of business can really do. So, Gareth and Sebastian, thank you for the work of the Chamber. Thank you for your ongoing activity. It's gone on for years. Great new leadership. And thanks to all the members of the Chamber. And I was promoting someone to join this week. So I will continue to remind people of the importance of this Chamber. And you keep doing your work and let us know when we can help. Again, on behalf of Minister Champagne, thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much for that, MP Rob Oliphant. And we did in fact get that new member. Thank you very much. Thank you to you, Minister Ng, and of course to all the ministers in the cabinet, as well as our chair alluded to earlier, the Prime Minister, for engagements we've had there. And of course to the members and to the supporters. And not least, that takes us, I think, very well into the next session, and that is with McKinsey and Company, a firm that has been by the Chamber's side, particularly in the reimagining and the re-envisioning of the organization into what we are today, built on the back of the 25 years of work, largely led by the former President Bruce Shapiro. And so without further ado, I just wanted to let everyone on the call know we will be switching now to presenter view. Acha, Leke, of course, and Mukani, Moyo are here. Mukani being a member of the board of the Canada-Africa Chamber of Business, leading the process for our re-envisioning and building us to where we are today over the past year. And Acha, Leke, of course, one of the most iconic leaders across the continent. And so it gives me great pleasure as we go into this session to invite these two individuals to lead us on this conversation. Acha is a senior partner at McKinsey and Company and chairman of McKinsey's Africa region. He has served governments, multinational organizations, and private sector institutions across Africa, dealing with all host of economic issues from taxes to growth and investment decisions, and his experience has been on the ground in over 20 African countries. He's a co-founder and member of the Global Advisory Council of the African Leadership Academy that is developing the next generation of African leaders. And he's also served extensively with the World Economic Forum on a host of committees, advising business schools, working with President Kagame at the African Union on reform. And he co-authored a book many of us know very, very well, The Africa's Business Revolution, How to Succeed in the World's Next Big Growth Market. Acha, I know you're from Cameroon, you're fluent in both English and French, so in a sense you are Canadian, and you hold a master's degree as well as PhD degrees in engineering from Stanford and from Georgia Tech. And I just want to also do a quick introduction to Mukani, your colleague based here in Toronto. Mukani is an expert associate partner in McKinsey and Company's basic materials practice. 12 years of experience at McKinsey. Mukani, I know you've served mining clients around the world. Originally from Zimbabwe, you hold degrees in electrical and computer engineering from the University of Cape Town, where I think we briefly crossed paths before you went on to get your MBA from the University of Chicago, Booth School of Business. Mukani, thanks for all you do for the Chamber, and over to each of you for the next session.
Thank you. And sorry, thanks, Gareth, for that introduction. And it's great. And by the way, you forgot to say, I actually grew up in Montreal, so I spent the first 10 years of my life in Montreal. So great to be reconnected with my Canadian roots. And it's interesting to know that you also have Wi-Fi problems in Canada, similar to some of the ones we have here on the continent. But on a serious note, I was very excited to hear about the Minister's passion for Africa and Canada's commitment to the continent. What I thought we would do is share with you a few slides about our perspective on what's happening with COVID on Africa. We've done a lot of analysis to understand the impact of the economic impact of the crisis on the continent, and then really open up for Q&A. So just quickly, starting maybe with where are we today on the continent? We have about 55,000 cases. That was as of this morning. We've been tracking this on a daily basis through the Africa CDC, and it's growing, right? But the reality is we haven't seen the exponential inflection point yet on the continent. And there are many questions as to why that is, right? Is it because of the weather? Is it because of the BCG vaccine? Is it because of the youthful population? Nobody knows, maybe a combination of it. What we don't know, what we do know actually, is that we're not testing enough, right? As a continent, we've done about 1 million tests to date. That's it across the entire continent. South Africa is leading that effort, but South Africa has done about 450 tests for every 100,000 people. Nigeria has done 10 for every 100,000 people. By the way, I don't know what Canada is, you know, the US is at sort of 1,500, 2,000 for every 100,000 people, right? So we're still very, very far from where we need to be. And part of it is because we just don't have enough testing kits, right? We'll come back to that. But that's at least where we are. Now, so three quick parts of the presentation. What is the economic impact of what I've just told you about? 2 is what are we doing then, you know, to protect lives on the health side, but also protect livelihoods on the economic side, and then how do we bring it all together? On the economic side, we modeled 4 scenarios. We'll come back to that. We modeled 6 drivers into those scenarios. We've done modeling across about 10 countries that account for 70-75% of Africa's GDP to really understand what the impact of the crisis is. What we model, like I said, is on one axis the global transmission, so how the virus is transmitted around the world. On the other axis is how it's transmitted in Africa. And you'll see sort of, you know, the least worst case, as we call it, is where the virus is contained in the US, in Europe, and around the world. And we're also able to contain it in Africa, learning lessons from around the world, but also from our Ebola, what we can learn from the Ebola crisis. And then there's a worst case situation where the virus, you know, there's a resurgence, especially in Asia, and there's a widespread outbreak in Africa, and everything in between. Now, the reality is we're actually not facing one crisis, but 3 crises. The first is a global pandemic, right? So that's disruption of the supply chains. For every dollar of product we manufacture in Africa, we import 40 to 50 cents of inputs, right? And so a lot of those come from China, so that has been disrupted. There's also lower demand for our export, right? Whether it's cocoa from Ghana, or oil from Nigeria, or flowers from Kenya, or cars from Morocco, right? The demand has plummeted significantly. The second is the Africa pandemic, which with the limited movement of people, you can imagine, you know, no tourists, right? Tourism is 8.5% of the continent's GDP. In countries like the Seychelles, it's 40% of their GDP, right? So that has had a significant impact on our economies, but also the disruption of ways of work, right? So household incomes, household expenditures have been significantly reduced, right? And also business expenditures. And finally, oil. Oil has had a huge impact on, especially the oil exporters. The Nigerian minister spoke 2 days ago. She said, you know, Nigeria is projecting oil receipts to fall by 90% in 2020, 90. And oil is 60% of the government's revenue, right? So you can imagine the impact it's having on that economy. It does, however, it's actually a positive impact for oil importers. When you put all that together, what you then get in terms of the outcome is, you see it on this page, there's only one scenario under which we believe Africa is not going to go into recession. But the reality is that scenario is looking less and less likely today. We believe, just like the World Bank has said, that it's very likely that as a continent, we're going to go into a recession, the first recession in 25 years, unfortunately this year. Now, about half of that is due to the Africa pandemic. So it's really the reduction in household expenditure and business expenditures. About 30% of that is due to the reduction, the global pandemic, that's reduction in demand for our exports. And about 20% of that is due to oil, right? You can imagine that mix changes per country, right? So if you look at Nigeria, under any scenario, Nigeria is going to go into recession this year. The government itself there is projecting minus 3.5%. So somewhere between our scenarios 1 and 2. 70% of that is oil driven. But if the outbreak lasts quite a while, a lot of the downfall is going to be due to the reduction in household and business expenditures. Look at South Africa. South Africa as well, under any scenario, unfortunately, South Africa and Nigeria, as you know, are our 2 biggest economies on the continent. Under any scenarios, is going to go into a recession. As you know, it was downgraded by Moody's, so that has compounded the effect. And the government is projecting about minus 6.1% growth rate, so that's somewhere between our scenario 2 and our scenario 3. And that is really due, a lot of it is due to the limited exports, is due to the limited tourism, and the household and business expenditure drop. So that's South Africa. If you look at Kenya, we actually project that Kenya, may experience positive growth. The government there is projecting sort of 1.5 to 2%. It actually started at a higher base, right? It started at a 6% growth for the year. That was a projection at the beginning of the year. Then with locust, it was brought down to 5.2% growth. But because of the high growth it started at, we still project that it could end up in positive growth. And like I said, we've done this for many countries, but that's just on the economic side, what's happening. So huge impact on the economy. Let's now talk about health and then talk about livelihoods. On the lives, we are starting from a very precarious position from our health systems, right? We have no more than 20,000 ventilators in Africa. There are 10 countries that have no ventilator whatsoever. There are another 10 that have less than 10, right? So, and you can see it across ICU beds and everything else. So usually our healthcare system, really lacks capacity for this disease. When you look, testing is another issue. Like I said, we're just not testing enough. Part of it, we just don't have access to the test kits. We looked at how many test kits will we need just for the disease to help those who are sick today, right? And it's somewhere between 5 million to we think it's more like 100 million, but it depends on the infection rate, as you can imagine. So if you see sort of a third of the Spain infection rate, if that's what we end up having, it could end up being, and this is in the short term, 100 days, we need probably 5 million test kits. But it depends on what you want to do. If you want to really test broadly, like South Korea has done, we're going to need up to 100 million test kits. We ran some epidemiological models for Africa to see where we may end up, right? And everybody, a few people have run the models. It's very clear that we could end up between 1 and 4 million cases on the continent. That's quite likely, and that's what people are starting to work towards. And the issue is, the peak is actually going to take a while, right? We're probably not going to see the peak here before August, September, right? So it's quite dire in terms of how much we need from a health perspective. Again, on the robust containment scenario, we'll probably need up to $1 billion from a health perspective. If it's less contained, we'll probably need more than that. We've been working with the Africa CDC to project the supplies that are needed, and we think that in the next month or so, at a minimum, we need about $1 billion to invest just for this disease. Not even accounting for all the other issues that we've had, on the continent. But that's the story on the health front. On the economic front, a couple more things. Today there are about, if you look at what happens on jobs, there are about 450 million Africans in the workplace. About 150 million of those are in formal employment, and the rest, 300 million, in informal employment. We actually project that about a third of all jobs in Africa are at risk. So of the 150 million formally employed, about 10 to 20 mil, call it 15, so that's about 10%. We believe actually just are going to be lost. We project another 30 to 35 mil will have some sort of salary reduced, so either going to work fewer hours, but they're just going to take a pay cut. So that's about a third of the formal jobs. Of the informal jobs, of that 300 million, about 150 million are in subsistence agriculture, and we project that most of the other 150 million will be affected. So a third of all formal and of all informal jobs are at risk. So it's a crisis like we've never seen before. Now, what are governments doing about it? They're, like everybody else, announcing stimulus packages. If you look at where we are, the reality is, with our stimulus packages, we're announcing about 1 to 1.5% of GDP. South Africa now has announced a 10% of GDP one, but that's roughly where we are. And that's very, it's way below what you really need, right? We've done some assessment to understand if we get hit like we did from the economic perspective, the GDP loss that we spoke about at the beginning. How much of a gap do we have relative to what has been announced? And you call it somewhere a 5 to 6% gap, right? And that sort of ties to the 100 to 200 billion dollars that our finance ministers have requested of the development partners to help close the gap, right? So that's where we are, again, on the economic side, on the health side, and then on jobs and how we're trying to close the gap. Now, if you bring it all together, what does that mean? First, we're facing a number of challenges that are different from other regions, right? Our fiscal space is limited, right? So if you look at our revenue to GDP today is about 20%, and we then take 22% of that to service our debts. Just to give you a sense, African governments were supposed to pay $44 billion this year alone just on debt servicing costs, $44 billion, right? So that's why we've asked for a debt standstill, and at least we've gotten it from the G20, so thanks to you all as well. For 1 year, we're trying to get it for 2 years, but we also work with the private banks to see if we can also get a moratorium with the private companies, also with China, right? So, but that's one. Secondly, our informal economies are incredibly informal. And so when we start to think about how we're going to support SMEs, about 70 million SMEs in Africa today, and they employ for somewhere to 250, 300 million people. You know, that's the bulk of the economy. So how do you really get the stimulus packages into the hands of these small businesses is not straightforward. The population, right? You know, we're the fastest urbanizing region in the world, but the reality is most people moving to the urban regions are actually moving to slums, right? And like somebody told me, when you live in a shack with 6 people, self-isolation is actually when you leave the house, not when you're in the house, right? So how do you deal with that? And some of the long-term impact of some of the measures like school closures. There's data that shows that when schools close for a long time, if fewer girls come back, right? So how do we deal with some of these measures? And we've talked about the healthcare system. Now, governments are putting a number of measures in place. I'm sure you've heard about them. All of them are setting up nerve centers to address it. Many of them are also helping address the health crisis, right? So trying to figure out how we flatten the curve. Then they talk about supply, food supply. We need to make sure in these lockdowns that the essential commodities are still available and at the right price. So a lot of focus is on that, on essential services. Then how do we protect the vulnerable, the population, right? Really protecting jobs is the big focus of governments. It's less about protecting businesses, but more protecting jobs. Maybe there's certain sectors, certain companies that need to be protected because it's strategic. It's about jobs. But on the other half is also the vulnerable population. How do we reach them? How do we create these social safety net programs? Because many of our countries did not have such programs. So very quickly trying to create them. You've probably heard of what Togo has done through a digital solution to reach the most vulnerable. So that's the third. And finally, of course, the economy, right? So running the scenarios for the country, figure out how big the hole is, what, you know, and where the stimulus package is going to come from, how to most effectively then stimulate the economy and get the money back into the economy, and how do you prepare for recovery. I'll skip private sectors. The development partners are really coming to the table and trying to support us, you know, with, like I said, the debt moratorium is one big thing they're working on. The procurement platform, we're working with Africa CDC and a number of development partners because you know, we are actually being squeezed out of the market. We're trying to buy supplies, we're trying to buy ventilators as individual countries. We're just being squeezed out of the market. So creating one common procurement platform, aggregating all the demand, and then making sure that we get the capacity that we need, either it's from China or from Europe, wherever we need it from. Right? So there's a big focus and effort going there, and a number of other initiatives. And just to conclude very quickly, on this whole issue around, there's a big debate, as you know, between the health crisis and the economic crisis, right? You know, like somebody said, you can either have a 10% chance of dying of corona or a 100% chance of dying of hunger. How do you deal with it? So we've been tracking how where we are today. More than half of the continent is under some form of a lockdown. I live in South Africa. We're in quite a serious lockdown here. But we've been tracking, so that's where we are. But a number of countries still have curfews and numbers have shutdowns, but that's where we are. Now, lockdowns have been very effective at slowing down the growth of the cases, right? It's very clear across Africa, but across the world, they've been very effective. However, they've been actually quite a disaster for the economy. So this is for South Africa. These are retail sales when we were in self-isolation. And then they gave us 3 days to prepare for the lockdown, so you can see sales went up because people went on panic buy. But since we're in lockdown, retail sales have gone down 90%, right? So it's a massive, massive impact. And so we've been working with many governments, helping them think through how to manage it, right? And what we found is many of them they're all thinking on one axis, sort of the Y-axis. They're really thinking more about what do you do with the general population. So do we close schools? Do we do curfews? Do we limit interregional travel? Do we do a partial lockdown? Do we do a full lockdown? What we're encouraging them to do, we're starting to see something that way, is there's a whole different dimension of people who are most at risk. Because what you're trying to protect is you don't want your healthcare system to be overwhelmed. And so the people who are most likely to end up in hospitals are the elderly or those who have pre-existing conditions. So if you can find a way to shield them, you can then leave the rest of the economy open, and hopefully you can manage the two, right? So you can see here in a scenario A where you do a full lockdown, about 70% of the economy is shut down, right? But that has a fewer number of cases. In scenario E, where you shield the most vulnerable, you can keep most of the economy open, right? And so countries are now experimenting with different levels here. We're helping them put data against it so they can actually manage and figure out from a data-driven perspective where they want to be based and how they want to manage the economy. And then finally, and I won't go into this, we're now starting to think, you may have seen we've published 2 reports, and if not, I'm sure we'll get them to you if you haven't seen them. We're publishing a 3rd one next week, which is, let's start, we've been very much in this sort of, it's a big crisis and, what's happening. But if we start reimagining how things could be different in Africa, so we have some themes about how do you reimagine society, how this is going to really accelerate digitization, how this is going to be an impetus for us to really transform the healthcare system across the continent. How do you reimagine business, right? Manufacturing, for example, how do we reshape the manufacturing sector to make sure it's more self-reliant and really focus on import substitution? How do we formalize our economies more? And then how do we imagine government, right? The role government is going to play. How do we forge a stronger social contract between citizens and governments? And we believe this is going to lead to a much more pan-African cooperation, as we've seen our leaders come together in a very unified way to address the crisis. So let me stop here. Just wanted to give you a quick overview of what's happening on the continent. Happy to take any questions.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Our first question of a whole number relate to how you do your comparisons between different economic patterns. How do you apply predictions between countries? So when you're comparing in Mali and Nigeria as the example, what is the methodology that allows you to kind of apply understanding the situation with economies and markets that are quite different?
Yeah, as I said, this was a very detailed analysis, country by country. So we literally have country teams. We're working today across about 10 countries, helping governments and the private sector in those countries. So for each of these countries, we have a very, very detailed analysis. We've only done it for about 10 countries so far, and we extrapolated to the rest of the continent. But it was very much bottom-up, understanding all those drivers and the impact you'll have on the economy and the impact you'll have then on GDP and then on jobs.
Excellent. Another question related to the informal sector. When we had our last in-person event in Ottawa, there was quite a lot of appreciation of how McKinsey is able to get a lot of data that is not captured. The question is, how do you generally incorporate the informal economy into these either projections or just analyses?
Yeah. So for these projections, generally this is all part of the formal economy, right? These are all sort of GDP type projections. As you know, the informal economy, people will argue, is probably 50% as big, but they're not captured today. Hence, you'll see on this point this whole catalyzed formalization. We think what the opportunity here is, there are about 70 million SMEs across the continent. Only about 20% of them are registered, right? So if you look at the stimulus packages that have been announced, about $8 billion have been announced going focus on SMEs. We have run some numbers to say we think SMEs actually need about $50 billion to survive the next 3 months, right? Just to survive the next 3 months. But now the stimulus packages that have been announced have only been for $8 billion. But what we think could happen there is those who are not, but for them, they're only really available to registered SMEs. And so we think what could happen, it could be actually a stimulus for governments to say, and we see governments like Ghana said it, to say, if you come and register as an SME, you could have access to this package, right? So we actually think there's an opportunity here for countries to really formalize their economies more and more, leveraging the stimulus packages they're putting in place. So that's one. On the other hand, we work, there's a lot of things we do through data, through digital. You can get a lot of data these days. We're doing a pulse check every 2 weeks now in a number of countries to just get a sense for how SMEs are surviving, how people are surviving. So there's quite a bit of data you can get through digital. But we think at the end of the day, the way to really make this happen is to continue to really drive formalization of our economies.
Thanks very much. Acha, the next question goes to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And I think the context to it is we're hosting the Trade Commissioner Wamkele Mene next week. What is the impact on the implementation of that deal in your view? And I think the question probably relates to policy and countries coming into alignment for the single African market that so many have been very, very excited about.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good question. We think this it's even more critical now, right? It has slowed down, it's very clear, because we've been focusing on addressing the crisis. But we would argue that it's even more important now. It's even more important to have one big Pan-African market, right? it's even more important to have much more harmonization of our laws and regulations. So for example, we're working with ECOWAS to help think about how to set up healthcare manufacturing across ECOWAS, right? Given that people are saying, look, we need to manufacture our own PPE, we need to manufacture our own pharmaceuticals, people are talking about vaccines. But what you have to be careful because you don't want every country to now try to do it, right? So we need a lot more harmonization to say who's good at what and who should focus on what for the region. And a different country could focus on another product, right? And so we think, coming out of this, there's a stronger impetus to accelerate implementation of CFTA and create a much bigger market for our products. But also, again, it will help us have one single voice, right, as other people look at Africa coming in. So we don't know if we're going to get there, but at least what we're pushing for is acceleration of the implementation.
Excellent. Coming from Botswana, we've got a question from the Botswana Institute for Technology Research and Innovation. Dr. Bathsheba wants to know that given the challenges faced by African healthcare systems when it comes to the availability of critical health equipment, how do you think we can create research collaboration synergies between Africa and, in this case, Canada, to develop, among other things, rapid test kits and ventilators?
But maybe I'll hand it to you all to talk about that. I think it's definitely absolutely critical to create more collaborations. What we're seeing is a lot more people trying to figure out how we can manufacture these locally. Right? You've heard about the $1 test kit in Senegal that people that were very excited about. South Africa is looking at how to manufacture ventilators. The reality is, even in the work I talked about in ECOWAS, for all the different, we're starting to figure out first what we want to manufacture locally, because it's actually not clear, right? Everybody's trying to manufacture ventilators, but at some point the market is going to clear, right? And if the ventilators we manufacture, if we can get them for a third of the price from China, then we're creating competitive industries, right? So we also think that there's a balance between urgency and sustainability that we need to manage carefully here, and really think through what are the products we want to manufacture. It's very clear that some of the PPE, masks, gloves, and those kinds of items, make complete sense. Certain pharmaceuticals will make complete sense to be manufactured here. So I think the first step is really to understand which ones you can manufacture and which ones you can do so competitively for Africa, but also potentially for the rest of the world as people start to diversify away from China. Then once you've done that, thinking through then who are the right partners to work with on that, and I'm pretty sure there will be exciting companies in Canada that will want to partner with it. But I just want to make sure that we believe that the focus is, before we get all too excited and everybody goes and starts manufacturing all kinds of different products, let's really make sure we can be competitive locally and across the continent.
Excellent. Next question that we've got is also from the continent. I know it's early days, but do you have any analysis on FDI into Africa since COVID, or any surveys you're aware of that show the relationship between the appetite pre-COVID and post-COVID for investing? And this is on the basis that it seems a lot of countries have turned inward during this pandemic.
Yeah, so we haven't seen the data yet, but I'm pretty sure the data is going to show a significant drop, right? We've seen a lot of flows of capital out, at least from the stock markets, out of the continent. So that's a quick one you can see. From FDI, I'm pretty sure the data is going to show a significant drop, right? Now the question is, we will get out of it. There's still opportunities. We believe there's still a number of opportunities that exist. Like I said, the acceleration of digitization creates huge opportunities for folks, who are playing in that space, whether it's on the digital infrastructure space or on the digital services space, right? The startups in the tech space, huge opportunity there. We see opportunities in healthcare, like we just discussed. Again, huge opportunities in healthcare for people who are interested. We see opportunities in sort of the retail, e-commerce, delivery space. We see a lot more of that happening, right? So in the midst of this, yeah, I can tell you that FDI, I'm sure FDI is going to drop quite a bit. But by the way, the companies that are actually going to win out of this are people who are going to not just focus on the crisis, but start thinking about opportunities and how can they position themselves now to then capture those opportunities over time.
Acha,
maybe something I could add.
Oh, sure. Please do, Mukani. Thank you.
Yeah. maybe there's something I could add there. I think, this is a very good point about, we need to be thinking not just about the crisis, but beyond this and what the future looks like. Those of you that have attended or participated in some of the other sessions the Chamber has led, where we've shared some of the work that my colleague Acha and others have done on the continent in terms of, what the fundamental or underlying drivers of the prospects for the continent are. I think it's important to realize that all of those still remain, right? So when we're talking about the underlying story around the demographics of the continent in terms of its growth, the young, fast, and rapidly urbanizing population with people moving into large urban centers, the fact that, these folks have needs that need to be fulfilled, that still stands and remains. The fact that we've seen over, in particular, more recent years, significant uptick in our manufacturing capability and capacity. I mean, there's still a lot of opportunity there, and there will be even more as companies have to think about how they need to make their supply chains more resilient, for example. The questions or points around infrastructure, this is one area the continent has in the past, or has historically lagged other parts of the world. That infrastructure need and gap to get to where we need to remains, and that's still a significant opportunity, as well as the other opportunities around, the resources, and the opportunity for digital to unlock and even create opportunities for leapfrogging. So I think, those fundamental drivers will remain and will remain valid. And of course, the impact of a crisis like we're in right now is to put a damper on that. But it's also important to, I think, keep in picture the longer term perspective.
Excellent. Mukani, there's actually a question to you related to these fundamental drivers. Given Acha pointing out the need to continue with the free trade deal, what are the prospects for a country like Canada, a strong free trading nation, to enter into a trade deal with a single African market, in your view?
Look, I think that's a terrific opportunity. Not only on both sides of that deal or transaction, there are many sort of advantages or things that Canada would bring to a partnership of that nature, and likewise on the other end. We believe there's a huge opportunity for Canada to not only be diversifying its trading relationships, but actually be growing opportunities, and likewise from the African side. We think on both sides there are big market opportunities to capture all of those needs, and some arrangement or closer collaboration in terms of an agreed set of trading terms would accelerate that. So we're excited that that opportunity is something that needs to be pursued.
Fantastic. And it's that given Canada was invited to, as a neutral third party in the formulation of the text agreed to by the countries, I think it's very exciting and speaks to Canada's role as an honest broker as well, in addition to the trade opportunity that's before us. Acha, the next question is to you. And again, to everyone on, I know your questions are coming through thick and fast. I'm going to get through as many as I can. Keep sending them. Acha, with so many critical elections scheduled for 2020, such as Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, what is the risk to political stability for a prolonged lockdown?
I think it's a very good question. First, there's a big question as to whether the elections are going to happen, right? I think first of all, right, because in some countries, they've not even been able to sort of register the voters, but that's a separate discussion. People are worried about a prolonged lockdown. I think folks are, we've seen some social unrest. People are saying at the end of the day, we cannot sustain this, right? 40% of Africans, live from hand to mouth. And so, if you don't work today, you can't eat and you can't feed your family. So that's the dilemma, right? But then the more we open up our economies, the longer we delay the peak, because now people are out and they're working and they're doing stuff and they're interacting. So I think what we may end up seeing is very much of a delayed peak. We may end up seeing a situation where our economies open up, maybe shut down over time. But I think what we'll then see is the domestic economy will function, but we'll basically be close to the international markets because as long as we haven't hit the peak, I don't think anybody's going to want Africans to fly to the countries. I'm sure Canada would think twice about it. I'm sure, foreigners will think twice about flying here, and even some of our export markets. So I think there's a fine balance here between the health and the economic crisis. But I think our governments are under a lot more pressure to say, look, let's figure out a way to balance the two, to reopen the economy, also to manage the social pressures. So I think the social pressures are less linked to elections, right? It's more linked to how countries manage the health and social crisis. Having said that, and that's our points here on the reimagined government, we believe coming out of this, there'll be a much stronger social contract between citizens and governments. You know, I think citizens have come to realize the importance of having good governance, right? And what, you know, good governments and good leaders have done, the decisions they've done. Also, they've understood that the decisions they've done have had a massive implications on their lives, whether the kids can go to school, whether they can leave the house, right? And so we believe over time, you're going to start to see citizens who are going to think more carefully about people they elect in power coming out of this crisis.
Thank you very much. Tatenda Manjengwa has got a question for Mukani on mining. Given such a heavy commodity dependence for many economies and the costs of production and the lockdown, how do you see mining firms surviving, and what are the implications for them in Africa, Mukani?
I think that's a great question, and I'd say there's a part of that answer. There's a part of that answer that's really independent of Africa. It's really, if you look at the mining industry globally, there are multiple sets of challenges miners are having to deal with. They're having to deal with the demand-supply shocks, with demand for major commodities coming down. It's a bit of a different story in gold, of course. They're having to manage through the supply challenge with their supply chains being disrupted. We've seen operations in different parts of the world either go into lockdown or have to idle operations. And typically in crises like this, when we look at what has happened in similar situations, the markets tend to go through this multi-phase response where there's sort of the initial shock, there's a readjustment to the demand-supply balance, and there's sort of reestablishing new sets of cost curves that determine the longer-term outlook. I think for Africa's resource players, there'll be a number of things that they have to think about. There's, first of all, the first sets of questions around just protecting their employees, protecting their staff, and in so doing, protecting the operations. They're going to be the immediate cash management balance sheet questions. They need to be thinking about how do we preserve cash and survive through the crisis at a time when, depending on what commodity you're playing in, you're seeing lower prices. To some extent, this is being mitigated in many countries by the exchange rate movements that we've seen. But beyond that, there will then be the longer term questions about, where exactly do the markets go in the medium to long term, and how do we set ourselves up for success in what's likely to be a more challenging market. And here, I think all of the levers and opportunities that the mining industry has been paying more attention to in recent years become even more important. The questions around how do we improve productivity, how do we drive up efficiencies, how do we think about digitization and using powerful tools of advanced analytics and so on to improve operational performance, safety, etc. All of those things become even more important in this context. But though this is all part of what the mine management teams and the host stakeholders, governments, communities, etc., will have to work through. It will have to be a multi-sectoral approach to protect what in some countries is a major contributor to the fiscus, export earnings, job creation, infrastructure investment, and so on.
Excellent. Question for either one of you relating to internal operations at McKinsey. How do you try build bridges between the Canadian clients you have and the investment and trade opportunities that you can clearly see across Africa, given the unique access you have on the continent?
Mukani, you want to take that?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think of forums like what we are on doing today, dialogues like this are critically important. We fundamentally believe that there are substantial opportunities on both sides. And there's a part of it which is about, first of all, building awareness and getting the right sets of facts in front of people. So the work that, my colleague Acha and team have been doing over the last several years, telling the African story and really making sure that there is a better understanding of, not just the story that we often hear about the continent, which is, often a more negatively framed story, but one that actually talks about the fundamental shifts and in the underlying drivers of the continent, the progress that's being made, whether it's on, economically, poverty reduction, health outcomes, etc. Just catching on a small point in Acha's opening remarks, he talked about how this year may be the first year in 25 years that the aggregate African economy goes into recession. That's a really positive story in the sense that, there's been 25 years of continual growth and progress on the economic front across the continent, right? So there's an important role for us to play in shaping and framing that story, and McKinsey's been very active in doing so. Many of you will have seen many of the publications that have come out the last several years. But we do believe there's more to go, and that is why bringing stakeholders together from the private sector, from the social sector, from the public sector, policymakers, etc., is critically important.
Excellent. As we're drawing to the close of our time, I'd just like to ask each one of you to consider any final concluding remarks. But I'll hit that final question right away before we do so. Acha, Leke, back on the Continental Free Trade Agreement matter, Jackson asks, how would its full implementation impact bilateral and multilateral trade relations between Canada and nations in Africa?
I mean, I personally think, it's an upside for everybody, right? I think what it would do, it will create a bigger market for, Canadian companies to access Africa. It will create more consistency for you across, because right now, companies complain when they go to Nigeria, there's one set of laws, and then they go to Senegal, it's a different set of laws, right? So I think it will create more consistency for you. I think it will create, in some ways, in some cases, one voice you can talk to deal with some of these issues, right? Look at the reform we're doing at the African Union with President Kagame. It's really about making sure that there's one voice speaking on behalf of Africa, aligning that. So I think on that side, for those Canadian companies, I think it will be incredibly helpful, right? I think, again, for us here, like I said, it will create a much bigger market. We have many economies that are very small, right? And so from a business perspective, it's just hard to really go and just focus on those economies. So create a much bigger market. So I actually think it's a win-win. And so, maybe I'll also end on this note just to say, it's a big crisis in Africa. We shouldn't underestimate it, right? But, like everybody's like somebody saying, you shouldn't waste a good crisis, right? There are a number of opportunities coming out of it. And I'll encourage all of you, members of the chamber, to continue to look at, consider opportunities in Africa, right? We have some issues we need to deal with, and we are dealing with them, right? But as you think about this, also have a mindset of what opportunities does it create? How would Africa look different coming out of this? And how can I position myself both to help the continent, but also to capture part of those opportunities?
Thank you very much, Acha. Mukani, any final remarks from your side before I hand over to the chair for any closing comments?
Yeah, well, I think a couple of things. First of all, really thrilled with the participation from everybody today, from amongst our membership and from members of the Diplomatic Corps, business community, and so on. It's terrific to see this level of engagement and interest on this topic that all of us here are very passionate about. And, absolutely, while we're in a crisis and our focus is first and foremost on health, safety, protecting lives, and doing what we can to look after loved ones, it's also important to make sure that we keep our eyes set on the bigger and longer term picture as well, including, what we can do to continue to, in this case, grow bilateral relations between these two regions, continue to propel the economic growth of the continent, and do similar on the Canadian side. We think there's a lot of opportunity here, and this crisis in some ways is demonstrating how much power there is in bringing our best minds and best efforts together. There is a rate of innovation right now in developing new ways of communicating, developing new ways of confronting the challenge, epidemiologically and otherwise. If we could keep even 5 to 10% of these new imagined rates of innovation, that we could unlock all sorts of wonders. So it behoves us to think about how we can take lessons learned from this crisis to push what we're doing forward.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And finally, to our chair of the board, Sebastian Spiro-Gabra, if you have any closing comments, you're most welcome to offer them up now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this webinar. Again, it's a real privilege to be in the company of our brothers Acha and Mukani, who really are among the leading thinkers in our generation on matters that have to do with growth and investments in Africa. And I think I would agree that out of this crisis has exposed, in a certain sense, some of the structural challenges that Africa has had. We have sort of sometimes papered over these challenges and given it a good spin. But this crisis, whether it's in the Italian healthcare system or in the American healthcare system, or in the success we've seen in South Korea and Taiwan, has really shown to the world who was prepared and who was caught flat-footed. And even within Africa, we would see variegated differences among countries, those countries that were prepared and those that were not prepared, and those countries that would emerge from this stronger and cohesive, and those who would emerge from this basically discombobulated. So in a certain sense, I actually think, much like our brother Acha said, that out of this, in a certain sense, we may have the newer generation of Africans who have been waiting in the wings and waiting in the wings and waiting in the wings. And we write papers and we do seminars and we go to conferences and we speak and speak and speak and speak and speak. And the older ones basically listen, and then they go back and they run Africa the way it has been run for the last 60 years. And for the first time, in a certain sense, they are turning to the young people and saying, how do I even do a Zoom call? I mean, you may be a company that owns a big family business. And for the first time, the older ones have to figure out how to do a Zoom call. They have to figure out, where are the doctors? Where are the public health experts? Where are the young people who can help them in different things? So in a certain weird sense, I think in Africa, we pray that somehow we are able to emerge out of this with very little debts. But if we do, I think that in a certain sense, there would be a preference for technocratic input. There will be a preference for seriousness in discussions. And as Acha said, even when you're going to vote, you have to ask yourself, I mean, if I have to go into a lockdown, do I want this drunkard being my leader, or I want somebody who's actually thought about the problems? So in a weird sense, I think that this crisis would usher us into the Africa that a lot of us have been waiting for the last 15, 20 years, and to accelerate the change. So the digitization of Africa, the more technocratic management of Africa, the mutualization of our destinies, and the sort of synchronization of different things in Africa. So these are sort of structural challenges that we've debated and discussed in very serious fora over the last 2 decades, but which have really not happened. For instance, you think of, let me give an example, like mobile payments. I mean, I remember when M-Pesa started in Kenya with mobile payments. And right now, everyone is on lockdown. So if you don't have a mobile payment system, how do you actually get your money to your grandmother? So in a certain sense, there are a lot of technical improvements. You think of robotics in mining. You think of a number of other things that we've been sort of discussing but haven't really accelerated forward. I hope and I pray that out of this, we would have all of that. And then finally, I think that fundamentally, the Africans are a spiritual people. I mean, in its fundamental sense of the word, And so I think that in a certain sense, this lockdown has also, and this crisis is going to get people to reflect. And so I am cautiously optimistic that if we can get out of the crisis, we would come out as an Africa that is, more willing to listen to science and facts and data, an Africa where the young people have a stronger voice, an Africa where governance is accountable, and an Africa where, we see ourselves more as a cohesive continent rather than the tribal divisions. This disease has no respecter of race, it's no respecter of tribe, it's no respecter of educational achievement, it's no respecter of any of these things. So I hope and I pray that out of all of this, all of us on this call, and thank you so much for so many people coming, and obviously the ministers attending, but I am increasingly more hopeful that I think out of this we would all come out and have more serious conversations. The health ministers going forward are not going to just make speeches in parliament and go to sleep. The people are going to ask them serious questions. How many hospitals are you building? How many beds do you have? How many ventilators do you have? I mean, these are questions we haven't asked a health minister in most countries in 20 years. How much savings do these countries have? The finance ministers are going to be asked these questions. So I am hopeful. So thank you so much again to our brothers for joining, and obviously to Mr. Neg and Member of Parliament Oliphant, Permanent Secretary, and others, and Ambassadors, Excellencies, and the members of the chamber, both in Africa and here, who have joined, and obviously to our very tireless President, Gareth Blow, who represents the very best of the Africa that is emerging. Thank you very much. It's a privilege to join you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair, for all of your leadership steering the organization, as well as to Mukani, to Acha, to so many others who have joined us. There's still hundreds of you on the call, and I would like to invite each one of you to join the chamber. There'll be an opportunity in the follow-up email to get some materials, but also to learn about the other events we've got. Those events are segmented. So we've got requests to do briefings, as Mukani's been a part of, to Parliament, but then we'll have those specific to particular industries. And so do sign up, become a part of this community, and join us in the continent. And if you're already there, keep flying the flag and doing the wonderful work you do. Canada is here, and we're proud to be a partner of choice. Thank you once again to each one of you, and no doubt we'll all see each other again very, very soon. Bye-bye.
All right.